My name is Karina Vold, and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology and a research lead at the Schwartz-Friesman Institute. I'm very excited to moderate today's SRI seminar featuring our guest speaker, Professor Joshua August Skorburg. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been a traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land, which is very precious to all of us. The presentation for today is going to run about 30 minutes, followed by roughly a 1-hour Q&A in which our speaker will engage audience questions, both from in the room and online. During the Q&A portion of the event, for those in the room with us, we ask you that you please raise your hand to ask a question and speak clearly so your contribution is captured for participants online. No microphone is required because this room is configured to pick up audio throughout the space. So with that in mind, I ask you to also please refrain from any side conversations during the event because those will also get picked up by the room's equipment. And we're also going to have some time afterwards for more conversations, and we welcome you to stick around and enjoy some refreshments and chat a little bit later. Refreshments are out in the hall. For participants who are joining us online, please use the raise hand function to ask a question. And a representative from SRI, in this case, Rachel Cates, will send a request when it's your turn to unmute. And alternatively, you can type your question into the chat, and then we'll convey that to the speaker. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's session, Professor Gus Skorburg, as his colleagues typically refer to him. Gus is an associate professor in philosophy and the academic co-director of the Center for Advancing Responsible and Ethical Artificial Intelligence, or CARE AI, and a faculty affiliate at the One Health Institute at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Gus previously served as an adjunct professor at the Fuqua Business School at Duke University and holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Oregon. His research focuses on applied ethics and moral psychology, with a significant portion of his published work exploring the philosophical implications of human interdependence with other agents and technology. I first met Gus back in 2016 when we were both visiting Duke University to attend the summer seminars in neuroscience and philosophy, and when we were both writing dissertations on the theory of extended cognition. And around 2017, both Gus and I started to think about artificial intelligence, and I was pleased to see a few years later that we both got hired at universities in Ontario. And so it's been nice to have this shared interest and collaborator nearby. So we're very excited to have Gus with us today, and we're very much looking forward to his presentation, which is entitled Decisions, 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 a Value-Based Account of the Attention Economy. So without further ado, Gus, the floor is yours.
Like this. I know. Yeah, okay. Great. Yeah, thank you all for coming. So thanks to Karina for the kind invitation, and thanks to all of you for coming. You know, arguably the nicest day of the year so far, and you're all like sitting inside to hear a potentially depressing talk about how the attention economy, you know, ruins all of our agency and autonomy. So I appreciate you being here. It's actually going to be more positive than that, don't worry. So I also want to thank Dylan White, who I think is in the audience, who is a PhD student working with me. He's a co-author on the paper that some of you may have read and that the talk is about today. And so much of the work I'll discuss today builds on some of Dylan's previous work. And so with that, I'll just kind of jump in. It's worth pointing out, I think at the outset, that still, even in the era of large language models, one of the most pervasive applications of artificial intelligence is what Ben and Lazar call automated influence. Right? So this is the collection, integration, and analysis of people's data to deliver targeted interventions to shape their behavior in various ways. And so sort of when this happens at scale, when there's been a sort of whole industry built up around it, this is the kind of thing that we often refer to as the attention economy. So for the purposes of this talk, when I'm talking about the attention economy, what I have in mind are things like social media, targeted advertising, recommendation systems, digital nudges, rankings, news feeds, and so forth. And so it's just, I think, worth it, to sort of recall and to keep in mind that the idea of an attention economy, right, a sort of marketplace where users can exchange their attention in exchange for various goods and services, is in many ways at the heart of the internet, right? It is the sort of business model of the internet, and it's precisely that business model that sort of is responsible, at least probably directly, if not indirectly, for the large scale text corpora that we use to train large language models that are now we're sort of all familiar with. And so I think that this idea of the attention economy really lays the groundwork in many ways for the way that most of us think about AI and the sort of AI questions that seem most pressing and important today. So of course, the harms of the attention economy are by now well known. So here's comedian Esther Povitsky in 2020, right? The idea is that like jokes like this wouldn't be funny if some of us didn't have experiences like that, like checking your phone for one thing, and then it's just like 40 minutes later, you're like, wait, what was I going to do? What's the weather again? So this is a sort of widespread phenomenon, right? I think the fact that it like shows up, in stand-up comedic routines in 2020, this is a sort of widespread cultural phenomena that surely everyone in this room and online are somewhat familiar with. But of course, it's not just in pop culture, right? Philosophers have taken a lot of interest in this as well. So, in Shannon Valor's latest book, she has this quote from Sam Altman, who says, our phones control us and tell us what to do when, social media feeds determine how we feel, search engines decide what we think. And so for Valor, she says, if we just like take this on board and we take this at its face, she says, this is akin to your drug dealer telling you that since your heroin addiction has already destroyed your personality, agency, and hopes and potential, you might as well quit fighting and go along for the ride. And so as you'll hopefully see throughout this talk today, I think there's a couple really important ideas that I've bolded here, right? These ideas of attention, addiction, agency, personality, right? These are going to be a main theme of the talk today. Now, of course, I don't want to pick on Shannon only. There's lots of book-length treatments here. So I'm just putting sort of two sort of recent books up here of philosophers sort of detailing the ethical, moral, psychological harms that are associated with the attention economy. So James Williams, Tim Aylesworth, and Clinton Castro, as well as like a wide range of publications in very mainstream prestigious philosophy journals. So it's not just people in pop culture that are worried about the harms of the attention economy. It's in sort of mainstream discussions in philosophy as well. And so to get a bit more specific, right, what are philosophers concerned with when they talk about these harms of the attention economy? We get lots of claims about attention economy undermining autonomy, both at individual levels and perhaps collectively, deteriorating our attentional and moral skills, threatening democracy, right? This is that idea of threatening our collective autonomy, overwhelming our capacities for self-control, and causing social media addiction, right? Just to name a few in terms of some recent high-profile publications. But I think there's a tension here, right? And so this is going to be the main focus of the talk, and where I try to live for the next 20 or 30 minutes is exploring this tension. So I want to get clear on one thing. I think the harms of the attention economy are real. Okay, and so nothing that follows in this talk should sort of make you think that I'm denying these harms are real or saying they're somehow unimportant, right? I think they are real. I think they are important. However, the ways that people talk about the harms of the attention economy are at best empirically unsophisticated, and I think in many cases outright false, right? So to sort of give you a preview, lots of people in the attention economy talk about this sort of ethics of the attention economy, talk about how it overwhelms our self-control. But it's been very striking to me and Dylan how few people in this literature bother to say what they mean by attention in the first place and what they mean by self-control. And so very often in this literature, what you see is instead a reliance on vague kind of folk psychological notions of things like control, compulsion, and addiction, right? So I think this rhetoric is often used, again, sort of in the wider pop culture setting, but also in mainstream discussions in philosophy and psychology. And so one of the things I want to try to get across today is that I think that relying on these intuitive, vague, folk psychological notions of things like compulsion and addiction, they present a major impediment to understanding the nature of the attention economy. And more importantly, they present a substantial barrier for figuring out how to fix it. Right. So if you've got a mistaken view of what the harms are, it's really hard to understand how to develop effective interventions to fix it or to mitigate it. Okay, so that's going to be the main argument, right? So what I want to do in this talk and what we try to do in the paper is to develop an empirically responsible account of the harms of the attention economy. So what I'll do today is first quickly summarize what I'm calling this received view. And so I've already hinted at it a little bit. This is in what some other published work Dylan calls the control argument. So I'll quickly highlight that and identify some of the main features of the control argument. And then I'll spend most of the time developing an alternative to this control argument, right? What we call a valuationist alternative. So I'll say a bit more about what that means and try to show how it differs from the main views in the literature today. And then I'll conclude by highlighting what I think are several of the important upshots of this valuationist alternative, or how it sort of allows us to do a lot more things we'd like to do in that vein. Okay, so let's start with the control argument. So in a recent paper, Dylan points out that this control argument, almost no one spells it out explicitly, but a lot of the papers that deal with the ethical issues in the attention economy assume this in various forms. And so the arguments tend to go something like this, right? Attention can be automatically captured by bottom-up stimuli. Okay, so this is familiar. Okay, you're sitting at your desk, you're writing, all of a sudden you hear the ping on your phone, and it's like before you know it, you're already attending to where your phone is. You didn't really try to do it. It seemed like it was out of your control, right? So that's like the sort of paradigmatic example that people return to over and over again. So our attention can be automatically captured. This attention capture is automatic. It cannot be prevented from happening, right? So if someone just like drops a loud pot or pan behind you, you kind of can't help but orient your attention towards it. It seems to be the sort of thing that is outside of voluntary control. And then the third premise, right, one of the key ones, is that this is basically what the attention economy does, right? The attention economy automatically captures our attention in this way. The sustained loss of control over our attention is harmful. Therefore, the attention economy is harmful because it reliably and frequently causes us to lose control of our attention. Okay, and so you sort of see that in a lot of the pop culture analyses, but I think, more importantly, even in the more serious sort of philosophical treatments, almost everything follows some version of this kind of argument. Right? So a hallmark of these sort of arguments is that they often rely on anecdotes and vague metaphors, right? So in James Williams's book, which I put up a few slides ago, he talks about the burdens of impossible self-regulation and our tendency to lose control over our attentional processes in light of the sort of addictive potentials of social media. Aylesworth and Castro, as we become addicted to the dopamine surge we get from our phones, we weaken our frontal lobe's executive function, and this makes us worse at sticking to a task like reading a book. It's been, attention economy has been compared to digital heroin. We talk about, persuasive design that can hack the brain. And so, I think Dylan and I read enough of these papers, and we just said, like, where are choice and agency in this? Right. And so the way that users, right, and again, talking about billions of people who regularly use social media, for example, on a lot of these accounts, they're sort of set up, or they're painted as these passive agents, right? It's just like we're puppets on the strings of the sneaky software developers developing these algorithms that we can't resist, and videos that we can't stop watching, and notifications that we can't ignore. And it just seemed to us that this dominant way of thinking about the harms of the attention economy is one that has no place for users to make choices, and that makes human agency greatly diminished. Right? It's like we're at the mercy of the clever software engineers. And that's not a picture that we find very attractive. And so that's really the motivation for this project, right? Is to sort of put some agency and some choice back into the really important discussions about the very real harms and the ways in which social media and the attention economy are making some people's lives worse off, right? But we want to make sure that we preserve this idea of decision-making and agency. So how do we do that? Well, our sort of intuition is okay, so a lot of these papers, a lot of the way people are talking about the ethics of the attention economy, they're invoking this idea of attention being captured. They're invoking this idea that the sort of bells and whistles of the attention economy can overwhelm our capacity for self-control and self-regulation and executive control. And so, our thought is well, let's go look at the vast literature in cognitive science and in neuroscience on attention and on self-control and, see what the people who study these constructs and have for decades might be able to tell us about the way these technologies are impacting people's lives. So what we'll do sort of in this talk is draw from a lot of different sources, right? Kind of trying to grab and triangulate from a number of places. So most notably, I think in book-length treatments, the work of Wayne Wu and Peter Carruthers, Julia Haas, who I know was a previous speaker at one of these seminar series, Peter Railton, and Chandra Sarpada are sort of among many of the people that we draw from, developing this view that we're broadly going to call valuationism, right? And so this is the alternative we want to pose to the dominant ways that the harms of the attention economy are framed in the sort of mainstream discourses. So what do we mean by valuationism? Well, if you want it in the form of a motto or a slogan, here's Chandra Sarpada. Every time an agent acts, they do so on the basis of representations of the value of their actional options. Okay, so for Sarpada, this is a very wide-ranging and encompassing view of human agency, right? It essentially involves value-based decision-making. And so we think one of the upshots of these views is that the sort of valuationist picture that we'll sort of paint here is one that triangulates and grabs information and empirical support from a wide range of sources, including neuroscience, neuroeconomics, psychology, computational social choice, and reinforcement learning. Okay, and so what we see across a lot of these fields is a claim with, I think, decades of empirical support across many paradigms using lots of different methods that core aspects of our psychology, including decision-making, attention, self-control, motivation, motor control, and even more besides, are best understood and well modeled by value-based decision-making processes. Right? And so we think about the valuationist hypothesis as one that reflects what you might call a kind of scientific meta-consensus, right? So I think that when you look at the sort of wide-ranging literature in judgment and decision-making, for example, so this is people in, business schools doing consumer studies, it's cognitive scientists, it's psychologists, it's neuroscientists, something like this idea of a value-based decision process is sort of underlying the way that people design experiments and build theories to model the ways that human makes decisions, right? So I think very often no one is like arguing for valuationism specifically in those terms, but it's present and it's sort of in the background, and it's kind of like the assumption that's required to model decisions in the way that we do. Right? So I'll just highlight a few key features here. Right? So according to Sarpada, agency is decomposed into a series of rapid decisional junctures. Okay, and here by decision, we don't really mean the like kind of folk psychological, I'm thinking about something and deliberating, where do I go for lunch? I mean, that's kind of a decision too. But what we're talking about here is something that is much more rapid. Right. So every time we act, right, how to move your body, whether I should reach for the cup of water, whether I cross my legs or don't, whether I scratch that itch on my back, whether you keep paying attention to me or whether you check your phone, right? All of these are sort of like micro decisions that we make. And according to Sarpada and many others in this literature, right? That's just what makes up human agency, right? Is this a sort of series of rapid, very pervasive kind of micro decisions we have to make about what to do most moments of our conscious awareness, right? And so we're faced with these decisional junctures all the time, right? And so the way that they get resolved, according to this big picture view, right, is through value representations, right? So we represent the expected value of taking a given option that is available to us. Okay, and so I put learned value misrepresentations here. So there's like going to be key components on sort of each of these as the view gets unfolded, right? So the first to highlight is that these value representations are learned. Okay, and so if they're learned, it also means they can be unlearned. And so that's going to be quite important for restoring this idea of agency back into the discussion of the attention economy, which I'll return to at the end. And as a value representation, they can both represent or misrepresent the expected value of a given action, right? So it's to say it makes sense and it's possible, conceptually possible, and we'll say even desirable, to attach accuracy conditions to these value representations. And I'll return to all of those pieces and unpack them as we go. But I think these are the two key components that we need, right? Agency is composed into these rapid decisional junctures. When we're faced with the decision, we resolve it by way of a value representation, right? Value representations represent the expected value of taking a course of action. And so this is the sort of standard textbook way in which the decision sciences model human decisions, right? So in standard sort of experiments in the judgment and decision-making literature, subjects will do things like learn to associate a monetary reward with an arbitrary symbol over many different trials, right? And so they might be, symbols that they don't recognize, that have no intrinsic meaning. And so they have to do lots of trials to learn what sorts of symbols are associated with what kinds of reward. And then through a reward learning process, people learn to select the symbols that are associated with the higher reward, right? So you're faced with a decisional juncture, you learn a value representation about, what's the association between the symbol and the expected reward, and then you preferentially select those that are expected to be more rewarding. Okay, and so this is sort of a very general high-level abstraction of the way a lot of this research sort of gets cashed out. And then what some philosophers have done is they've sort of taken those paradigms and, someone like Skorburg says, all agency is like this. Okay, so whether you're deciding, how to reach and grab the cup of water, or reaching for a cup of coffee, or deciding what to eat in the morning, or deciding what kind of person you want to be, right? It's all fundamentally these value representations all the way down. So for someone like Skorburg, that's just all agency is. Okay, for someone like Julia Haas, I think she takes a weaker view and will say lots of agency is like this, probably even most agency is like that, but maybe not all, maybe not committed to this idea as like a sort of grand unifying theory of the mind. But in general, even the stronger and the weaker views agree that like a significant part of what it is to be an agent is to make these kinds of decisions. And the way that we resolve these decisions is through a value-based decision-making process, right? So it involves this kind of philosophical inversion. Right? We tend to think intuitively that like as agents, we make decisions. Okay, but what this valuationist perspective is asking us to do is turn that on its head. Right? It's not so much that agents make decisions, but it's rather that decisions make agents. Right? Our agency just is this decision-making capacity on these views. All right, so for the purposes of this talk, again, I want to highlight, for many philosophers working in this vein, they do think this is something approaching like a grand unified theory of the mind that explains like lots of different aspects of our psychology. Okay, but for the purposes of this talk, I just want to focus on the two aspects that are most relevant to thinking about the ethics of the attention economy. And these are going to be, of course, attention and self-control. All right, so what I'll do is just briefly sketch a valuationist account, or how the valuationist understands the process of attention allocation. And then second, explain how the valuationist describes the process of self-control or self-regulation. All right, so as I noted in the outset, it's very surprising when you go look at all these papers in the ethics of attention economy, almost no one bothers to define attention or, say what it is they mean by it, much less engage with the nearly 50 years of, cognitive science and neuroscience on attention. Okay, so that seems like a problem to us. So I think that like most textbooks you read and the sort of leading accounts and the way that cognitive scientists think about attention is that it is a value-driven decision process. Okay, so the leading view is one of priority structure maps or priority state spaces that represent the expected value of attending to various spatial locations or to features, right? So these saliency maps or these priority structure maps integrate and they take as inputs many different sources, things like the salience of a stimulus, things like your learning history, and things like top-down goals, right? But at their core, what attention is it's a sort of value-driven process. Okay, so these value representations, which are shaped by reward learning, directly influence what we pay attention to and when and how. Okay, and so again, the way this is modeled, right, is very much through the processes and the algorithms described by reward learning, right? It's a process of learning. And so I just emphasize that to suggest, what is learned in this context can also be unlearned. And that's going to be crucial for thinking about the role of agency in the attention economy, right? And so the second piece to highlight that I also flagged earlier is that in a lot of sort of paradigmatic experiments on attentional control, when subjects in these experiments are able to associate on the basis of previous trials a location or a feature that gets associated with the reward, that becomes prioritized in future trials, right? So you see things like subjects automatically saccading to an area that was previously rewarded, even if they're explicitly told to do the opposite, right? And so even if it conflicts with current goals, even if it conflicts with top-down regulatory strategies. Okay, and so what that suggests again is that we can talk about accuracy conditions, right? We can talk about the degree to which these value representations accurately predict or not the actual value in the world of taking a certain course of action or not. Okay, so it makes sense to introduce a normative standard here. Value representations can be more or less accurate. Okay, people can be more or less skillful in the way they allocate their attention, and these are fundamentally driven by processes of learning. Right? So there's of course a lot more that could be said about this. Like as I hinted at, I'm summarizing 50 years of cognitive science on one slide here, but luckily we've got a sort of long time for Q&A. So this is sort of what we mean by attention. And so our view is very much that like when we're talking about the attention economy, that should be grounded in the best available scientific understanding we have of what attention is. And so my suggestion here has been that like the best, most empirically grounded account we have of what attention is that it's a value-based decision process. Okay, so that's all I'll say for now about the attention side. So what about self-control, right? Well, similarly, when you read these papers about the ethics of the attention economy and all the harms that it's doing to individuals and groups in society, very rarely do people bother to say what they mean by self-control, nor do they almost ever engage with the, again, decades-old literature on self-control, cognitive control, and regulation. This is an area that's sort of quite near and dear to me. I spent a lot of time during my PhD working in a neuroscience lab that was working on self-control and executive control. And one of the mottos of this lab, and I think of like many researchers in this space, right, is that there's nothing special about self-control, right? We tend to think about self-control processes as like, these like hot and cold processes where you've got this really hot desire where you're on a diet and, you see the delicious cupcake and you like really want to eat it. And it just sort of overwhelms your cold, rational kind of calculating plans to like not eat processed sugar or whatever. And like, that's intuitive, right? It makes sense. A lot of us probably have had some experience of that phenomenology, but it's just not borne out in the science, right? There are no hot and cold areas of the brain. Right? That's just not how it works. Like decades of research would have uncovered that if it were to be true. And so I think the most productive and sort of best supported research in this area recognizes that self-control is a decision just like any other decision, right? It's a value-based decision. There's no special domain here of self-control that's apart from other kind of well-modeled decision-making capacities that we have. And again, our phenomenology might make it seem like it is, but a lot of the processes we care about and the way that sort of emotion regulation and cognitive control and self-control work, right? They're very well modeled by the very same models and algorithms described, in the previous slide about attention, right? As value-based decision processes. So one of the most prominent is this expected value of control framework due to the neuroscientist Amitai Shenhav and his collaborators. And it basically says like, the top-down control that we can exercise. So, when you hear the ding on your phone that's sitting next to your computer while you're trying to write your paper and you say to yourself, no, I'm in the middle of the sentence. I'm just going to keep writing. I'm not going to look at it. Right. That's the kind of paradigmatic example of exercising top-down control. That just is value-based decision making. Right? We make decisions about how to exercise top-down control based on value representations, right? What are the value representations representing? Well, they're representing the expected costs and benefits. Okay. And so students do this all the time when they're studying. Okay. So they're studying for an exam and they have to figure out like, should I keep dwelling on this one part so that I get a deeper understanding and a better grade, or should I move on to the next item on the study guide, right? They're doing expected value of control. What they're doing is implicitly calculating, what's the expected value of lingering on this one study item relative to the reward of moving on to something new, okay? We do this with cognitive offloading, right? So, if you're sitting in and listening to a lecture and you're trying to decide, should I just commit what that speaker said to memory or, keep it in working memory, or should I like write it down and kind of like offload it to a piece of paper? Well, what are you doing? You're implicitly calculating the expected value and the expected control that's going to be required to hold something in working memory. And so this framework has really nice, elegant, robust predictions about like when people switch from holding things in memory to offloading it onto paper. Right? It's when the expected value of control of holding something in working memory is higher, then you switch to writing it down. right? This is how we model and understand the way people task switch in multitasking environments, right? You stay on kind of like one task, and then, you're kind of tempted to multitask. And what you're doing is this implicit expected value calculation, right? About what's the expected value of switching to the new task? Is it more rewarding? Is it less rewarding? Right? And so when the new task seems more rewarding, that's the moment when you switch. Right? And so these kind of average everyday processes that would be familiar to all of us, right, to all of our students, these are extremely well modeled and predicted and explained by these value-based decision processes, right? So there's no special faculty of self-control that we have that lives somewhere that allows us to like overcome temptations. It's all just decision-making all the way down, according to what I want to say are the best and most widespread and most empirically supported theories. Right. So that's the sort of whirlwind tour of the way that valuationists will think about what attention is and what self-control is. Right. And so how does all of this now relate to the question, excuse me, about the harms of the attention economy? Right. So as I've been suggesting, most of the literature on the ethics of the attention economy, they do talk about attention. They talk about our attention being hijacked, right? They talk about our inability to exercise self-control in the face of the distractions in the attention economy. But I think way too often they rely on these like anecdotes or like stories from stand-up comedians, vague metaphors, hyperbolic comparisons with digital heroin, and just like, yeah, very stretched metaphors, which again, like I get it, it's intuitive, but we have just like decades of established research across many different fields that give us very mechanistically precise, highly explanatory, and more precise ways for thinking about these very phenomena that we're invoking. Right. And so we think that in contrast with the way that philosophers have tended to think about the attention economy, the valuationist accounts of attention and control are empirically well supported, right? They're triangulated in the sense of like lots of different methods, given lots of different theoretical assumptions, all the way from like, fMRI and neuroimaging up to behavioral measures to self-report, right? So many different methods across so many different fields converge on this view. Right, that thinking about decision making in terms of a value-based process is just like the best picture that we have. Right, it's mechanistically precise, so we can use sort of a family of methods known as sequential sampling models, drift diffusion models, reinforcement learning algorithms to very precisely model the way people make decisions in these domains. Right, these tools give us a way that they're sort of an explanatorily powerful frame. Right, it allows us to explain the phenomenon we care about. And I think really, really importantly, they actually can capture the phenomenology that people experience, right? So one objection you might have is like, okay, great, you've got this sort of drift diffusion model of attention and decision making, but like surely no average person, experiences themselves as doing the kind of like statistical physics, ballistics as they're sort of modeled, right? That doesn't capture phenomenology, but actually what I'll go on to suggest at the end is that, yes, these models are mechanistically precise, but they also do quite a good job of capturing phenomenology. And so for all these reasons, we think they should be preferred to the dominant ways that that they tend to be talked about. All right, so I'll just conclude with some upshots of this view. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that a lot of the slides I put up, right, talk about this idea of like, the attention economy being addictive. Right, and that social media is addictive and that it sort of forms these compulsions in people. And the first thing to point out is like that framework doesn't even work with drugs of abuse. Right, it doesn't even work with crack cocaine and heroin. And you're telling me that's the way we're supposed to understand the attention economy? That seems highly unlikely to me. Okay, so here again, the work of Chandra Sripada and Hannah Pickard, I think are very useful and relevant. Right, and they show like just listen to the first person testimony of addicts. Right, they almost never describe having overwhelming compulsions that they couldn't resist. So if you just listen to the people in their own words, that's not how they experience their addictions. Okay, and so again, if addiction in these cases of drugs of abuse were truly compulsive in the sense that people couldn't do otherwise, then it should be impossible for addicts to quit cold turkey, right? But we have evidence of that. Right? If people were truly compelled and couldn't do otherwise, right, and their brain was truly hijacked by these drugs, then they shouldn't be able to do delay discounting, right? Foregoing a smaller reward now for a larger one later. But we have evidence that people do this with crack cocaine. I have no idea how they got that approved by the REB, but right, there is evidence of this, right? That people will forego a hit now for a greater one later, right? So compulsion models would predict that that's impossible. Okay, and so our view is like, if it doesn't even work with the case of drugs of abuse, how could that possibly be the right framework for thinking about social media? Right? It just seems like that can't possibly be right. So instead, what we advocate is arguing for things like unreliable or impaired control, right? Not impossible, right? But it can become impaired. It can become unreliable. Okay, so value representations can also misrepresent, right? So people can sort of misrepresent the potential value of using a drug and the reward it's likely to bring. And they can be incorrect about that, right? And in fact, in a forthcoming book, I believe Sherpato will argue like this is how we ought to understand addiction, is as a form of systematic distortion, right? Addicts suffer from systematic cognitive distortions about the expected value of using, right? And so the key point, though, right, is that there's accuracy conditions here, right? The value representations can be more or less accurate in representing the expected value of an action, and they're learned, right? And so if they're learned, it means they can be unlearned. Okay? So a second upshot is this idea of kind of capturing phenomenology. Okay, so I didn't put it on the slides here, but maybe I'll just pull it up during the Q&A to sort of give you a better sense of it. But the way that like a lot of people in decision sciences model at least like binary choices are using these so-called drift diffusion models or these accumulation to bound models. And basically the idea is that you create these decision thresholds, right? Option A versus option B. They each create a sort of decision threshold. And then you accumulate evidence as you're deliberating about what to do. And basically the magnitude of your value representation will dictate the rate of evidence accumulation. So the stronger the value representation, the quicker you'll accumulate evidence towards that decision bound for that option. Right. And so what's really nice is, and what a lot of work has shown recently, is that sort of process and that temporal sequence of accumulating evidence correlates very nicely with people's subjective experience of feeling drawn or pulled to an option or feeling sort of aversive towards an option, right? So the rate at which evidence is accumulated and the way they're modeled in these frameworks maps on very nicely to people's subjective experience, right? And similarly, right, on these models, when a decision is reached, which is to say the evidence accumulation passes one of these thresholds or bounds, right, that's the moment of a decision. And again, you see these nice studies showing that, like, the moment of a decision when they're modeled here is, maps on very nicely to people's subjective experience of like, oh yes, that was the moment when I made the decision. Okay, so despite the fact that you can use sort of very sophisticated statistical techniques to model this, they actually do seem to map on, very nicely to people's subjective experience. Okay, and so in a recent paper, Dan Bernstein, a 2025 paper in Synthèse, he sort of argues that like we've actually got evidence like at the level of neurons that this is what the brain is doing. So he actually argues for a straightforward like psychological to neural reduction of decision making on the basis of these accumulation to bound models. Okay, so we've got evidence at the level of sort of neural mechanisms all the way up to phenomenology, saying like this is just the best way we have of understanding what decisions are. All right, so two more pieces here, and then I'll look forward to some questions and some criticisms maybe. One of the upshots, we think, of this valuationist view is that it makes it very easy to account for the value of the attention economy. Right. So one thing that might be striking is if you're reading a lot of these papers on the ethics of the attention economy, is like nowhere in them is anyone talking about the ways subjects find the attention economy valuable. Right. And it's kind of like a weird thing. Because there's like billions of people using these things every day. And there's not really a clear theory of like why people find it so rewarding. Okay, so most of these ethics papers are just talking, again, it undermines our autonomy, it turns us all into addicts, right? But it totally doesn't have anything to say about like why people like it, why they find it valuable, why they keep using it. And so you sort of have the impression from reading a lot of these papers that like we're all just these hapless addicts doing this thing that's horrible for us, but there's no story about like why people would do that in the first place and why they find it valuable, right? And so one really nice thing about this valuationist picture we want to say is that it has a really clear story to tell about like why people use social media so much and compulsively because they find it valuable. Okay, now there is a downside to this though, is that once I started taking this view seriously, I kind of realized like, oh shit, it's like maybe it's just my lectures that suck, right? Like maybe TikTok is just more rewarding to my students than listening to me talk. And so I like have this view and I'm like, man, yeah, that's like a rational decision for them. Like they find TikTok more rewarding. The problem isn't with them, right? We were very commonly, the kids are all addicted to social media. They can't pay attention in lecture. Well, maybe it's just more rewarding than what we're putting forward. Right. So I'm sorry if this, at the end of the talk, you have a sort of lower view of your ability to engage your students, but I do think it's like also helps us to not sort of demonize them in this way. But it's important, right, that any theory of the attention economy does have a way, sort of a story to tell, right, about like why people find this so valuable. Okay. So two more points. I think in general, across the cognitive sciences, when we start modeling psychological phenomena of interest in terms of processes, right, that unfold over time. That allows us to sort of develop more targeted and successful interventions. Right. And so thinking about the sort of decisions involved in the attention economy as a process unfolding over time in the way that cognitive scientists of attention and self-control tend to think about these processes and the components that make them up, right? It allows us to be very precise and say, look, there's going to be some parts of that process that we just can't intervene on, right? So like, if someone just slammed that door, right, none of us, we all couldn't help but look at it. Okay, so that automatic orienting, that's not a place where you can intervene with voluntary control. Right? But perhaps later appraisals of it, the engagement of self-regulation, the bringing to bear of top-down goals, well, that is a place where an intervention might happen and where learned patterns could be unlearned. But it's just very important to be clear about where are the processes where you can intervene and where they're not. And so these kind of vague, metaphorical, we're all addicted to our phones thing, they give us no insight about what to do about that and where to intervene. Whereas I want to say these kind of more mechanistically precise models give us actual targets, right? And they give us ways to intervene. And so lastly, and I think this is the most important part, the picture that I've been trying to paint here about, value-based decision-making is one that like gives people agency, right? It's one where like we choose, right? We make decisions about whether to engage in social media and in what ways and how. And it's a choice that in some sense is up to us. Right. And so the value representations we learn that can lead to harmful relationships with this technology can absolutely be unlearned, right? On many of these pictures. It may be difficult, in some cases, may be extraordinarily difficult. But like the picture I've been painting here is one that puts agency at the center, right? It just says agency just is making these decisions. Whereas I think the dominant way we tend to think about the ethics of the attention economy, this control argument, is one where we don't have a lot of agency and control. We're at the whims of these developers who, come up with these sticky apps that we can't help but use and that we become addicted to against our better judgment and our will. But there's very little agency there. And so in the paper, we try to say like, no, we need to put agency and decision kind of back front and center in these debates about the attention economy. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion and conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Gus. So we're now going to move into Q&A, and I already see some questions and some hands up, which is great. For just as a reminder for in-person participants, please raise your hand if you have a question. And again, as a reminder, this classroom is equipped with audio sort of throughout the space, so there's no need for a microphone. But again, please refrain from any side conversations for the same reason. And for online participants, please use the Zoom function to raise a hand or pop it in the chat, and one of the members of our team will facilitate the contribution. All right, with that, I see quite a few hands. I'll start with who I saw first, this gentleman over here to the right, and go ahead.
Great talk, thank you very much. Is it possible that AI algorithms are an implicit valuationist theory? Like you're talking about accounting for the choices we make, and they're built in. They're built in. With an implicit theory is built into AI algorithms. Capturing attention is giving you something you value.
Yeah, and I think that like that's, I mean, it's the sort of like double-edged sword nature of this, right? And so I think one of the reasons that these the frameworks are so explanatorily powerful is that they give us a really good story about reward learning in mammals, for example. So like reinforcement learning just models across lots of mammals, right? The way that they learn, and it's like once you're equipped with that theory, then you can optimize, right, for ways to sort of leverage that learning procedure. And I think there's just explicit evidence of this, right? I mean, I think it's, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, like the American Psychological Association sort of released this statement just saying like, look, PhDs in psychology shouldn't go work for these tech companies that are designing these tools that are like causing, depression and anxiety in teenage girls, right? Like that's not what our profession should be about. And, we don't think the best and brightest learning theorists and people doing, human preferences, they shouldn't be using that knowledge to build tools that enrich companies and, lead to sort of self-injurious or self-harm behaviors in children. But it's like this double-edged sword, right? It's like once you've got that theory, then you can leverage it. So I think I think it's a very valid concern. I think it's just borne out too.
Good, thank you. I see Jesse.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly how this figures in here, but it seems to me that at least point about how this speaks to these models that say we have no control or whatever. This valuation theory frankly can kind of easily be subsumed, right, into that same story that we don't have control or whatever. Insofar as we're sort of in a position to have to say something about what fills up the content of a value assessment, right? So like the drug addict, the model works great to say that they're putting off, this reward for this later one because that one is more valuable, whatever. But then, sort of the immediate question is like, okay, so the the technologies that are controlling us are exploiting the things that we would find more valuable. And that's sort of the same outcome happens. We just now have this value-based model scaffolding this argument for the same thing.
Yeah, and I guess, and I think that's right. So like the value representation just gets filled with what people find rewarding about social media. To the previous point, right? It leverages exactly the way, our best understanding of the way that humans develop these value representations. But I guess what I take the upshot of the view to be is this emphasis that like value representations are learned, right? And so if they're learned, they can be unlearned. And so like patterns of attention, they're like as a process, there are parts of it that can be uncontrolled, but there are parts that can be controlled, right? So one of the ways I think that Dylan and I try to think about it is like, it may be true kind of synchronically in the moment that someone who's been, obsessively using TikTok for years, right? In the moment of reaching for them, maybe they don't have, strictly speaking, control over that action. But I guess what we want to point out is like that's the result of a learning history, right? That's the result of a long series of associating rewards with certain actions. And so in the same way, those associations can be built up to the point where it does seem very hard to control to the point of being addicted or compelled, right? They can equally be unlearned, right? Through the very same processes. And I guess the worry is like, in the way that most philosophers talk about the harms of the attention economy, it's like, we don't have any agency to do that. Right? That it's not clear what we would do to resist it. And, the suggestions that are often thrown out are just like, down with capitalism, right? Which might not be wrong, but like, it's not particularly actionable, in the moment where we sort of think like, we can look at the ways that people have modeled for like, so in Wayne Wu's book, he talks about like expert and novice attention, right? And the way that like people can be more or less skilled in the way they allocate attention. And so we can avail ourselves of that research to design strategies for individuals that don't require, large scale regulation of international companies to just promote forms of reward learning that are more in line with the kinds of values people themselves profess about the goals they want to pursue. And I guess it just seems like we get a clear roadmap for that on this value-based decision-making picture, and it's unclear what the roadmap is when we're just saying in a very loose and fast way, people are addicted to their devices, or it's like digital heroin. It's like, what do we do then?
I'm going to suggest we jump to the question in the chat now because David DaCosta asked something that I think is a nice follow-up to this.
Yeah.
David, do you want to unmute? Always an awkward second where they decide. If not, we can, we'll just read that out loud then. Rachel, do you mind reading it out?
Sure. David asks, can everything learned actually be unlearned? And then follow up, sorry if I missed this, but it feels not intuitively my subjective experience.
And he did ask something a little bit before that too, if you don't mind scrolling up a little bit.
Sorry, the longer comment?
Yeah, the longer comment, or maybe it was just a comment, I'm not sure, it was right up on top of that.
Yeah, so he said, I think it oversimplifies the phenomenon of addiction, why some people are dramatically less likely to become addicts who form very quote unquote dangerous addictions that have obvious consequences, yet a different subset of the population finds it radically harder to stop this behavior.
Yes, they're slightly related, but maybe you can take what you want from that, Gus.
Yeah, so maybe, on the first part, right? So can everything learned be unlearned? No, I don't think so. And I think it's absolutely right that there will be various personological factors that predict some groups finding it harder to learn than unlearn. So I think the point we want to commit to in the paper is that we shouldn't be putting forward models that take agency out of the picture. And so I think, and this is a sort of like delicate balance, right? I think we're able to do that while suggesting that indeed, in many cases, there are going to be situations where it's, extraordinarily difficult to invoke control, right? To invoke or regulate self-control. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, right? And so I think we want to try to strike that balance. And I guess, the sort of flip side of that is that we're going to have to bite some bullets, right, on potentially uncomfortable views about the nature of choice and various, behavioral or substance use addictions. And that's a bullet we're willing to bite, I think, because the alternative of thinking about addictions in terms of compulsions, where people couldn't possibly do otherwise, just isn't a view that we find attractive, that we find in accordance with the sort of empirical literature on the case of substance abuse. And so the inference is based, like, if it doesn't work for drugs of abuse, like, then it can't possibly be right for the attention economy and social media. It's okay. And then maybe to the second point, right? Like, feels not intuitive to subjective experience. I don't know what to say about it. I think I can sort of point to, some of these studies that the sort of pulls and draws of, like, feeling compelled or drawn towards one option or averted from another do seem to be well modeled by these accumulation to bound and sequential sampling models. Is it going to capture everyone's intuition? Like, right, I expect not. But then I'd want to know, like, what's a better model that does capture the subjective experience that, does that still have the same sort of predictive power, the same explanatory power? Is the alternative model going to be one that enjoys support from all these diverse methods and all these diverse disciplines? So I think that's what I'd want to hear more about.
Thank you, Gus. And there were a few questions. I'll try to go around the room. So Kimberly?
Thank you. You've framed this approach as being agency enhancing. From a lawyer's perspective, it sounds a little bit responsibility shifting too. Shifting responsibility for, the harms that are occurring to the agent.
Yeah.
Rather than the tech company. And in fact, you made that explicit just a moment ago by saying, in effect, this is an alternative to regulating big tech companies. So I'm wondering whether you commit to that implication of your reasoning, or does it just mean a different kind of regulation for the companies, which is a regulation that seeks to, I guess, enhance the ability of the agent to exercise the kinds of choices that you're talking about?
Yeah, good. And so, thank you for the comment. So I may have said this in a way I didn't intend. And so the claim is that this is an alternative to regulation, right? And so I think in the paper, we even have a paragraph where we say, they should happen both, like both should happen. We're not opposed to regulation. We're not saying this is an alternative to regulating. And, I don't know. I read John Haidt's book, and so I'm in favor of a lot of the views about restricting access to this, private accounts before a certain age based on adolescent mental health, right? So I absolutely think that there are regulations that need to happen. I'm not trying to pitch this as an alternative. It's just that if you're someone who thinks that these harms are incredibly pressing and like matter right now, I don't want to only just wait for regulation to come to pass, which may never come to pass. But there are things that individuals can do. Right. And so you're quite right that one implication of the view is that it does potentially come across as saying that you're shifting the burden to the individual. And I think we want to say, yeah, like that's a bullet we're willing to bite. There are some sort of negative consequences of putting this impetus on the individual. But I guess on balance, we think that like prioritizing decisions and agency as a sort of like guiding light, as kind of like a North Star in these discussions, is one that's going to be more productive over the long term than emphasizing the ways that devious software engineers create these tools that we can't possibly resist. And so, I acknowledge that there are bullets that have to be bitten here, but I think that our view is just like agency and autonomy should be at the core and should be first. But that doesn't rule out sort of structural kinds of interventions. Does that maybe there's another question there? I don't know if I addressed all of it.
No, I think it does answer most of the question. I suppose another way to look at it would be to look at the responsibility for perhaps some of the creation of the value misrepresentation.
Yes, good. Yes, right.
I didn't say that before, but that might be part of the kind of way that you frame the responsibility of a tech company.
That's good. Yeah, that's right. And that was the thing that popped into mind. So thank you for bringing it up, right? Is that I do take the view to be compatible with the fact that, like, you know, it's not to say that agents, it's always up to us what the value representations are. And our sort of digital and technological environments can be such that, like, overwhelmingly make it more likely that people are, you know, going to acquire these certain kinds of value representations. And that is a problem. That's a problem where structural regulation might intervene. But again, what I like about these models is it gives us specific ways to test that and specific sites for intervention, right? And so it's like very much centering, like, let's look at the ways people develop these value representations in these contexts and use that as a target. And I think that that level of specificity is missing from much of the public discourse about the harms of the attention economy. Yeah.
So at the end, you made a comparison between looking at TikTok versus listening to lectures.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe looking at TikTok has an instant release of dopamine, so it has this short-term reward, whereas listening to a lecture has a longer-term reward. So is
Hopefully.
so is there such a thing of a categorization of rewards, or is it just us miscalculating that the short-term reward is higher than having to wait to reach that longer-term reward?
Yeah, it's a super good question. So I think, like, in writing this paper, Dylan and I have gone back and forth on exactly this point the most, and we're trying to figure out sort of where our view is. And so the example we use in the paper version of this is, like, so you imagine a student who, you know, really, like, has the goal of, like, getting, you know, a good grade and getting into med school, right? And, like, that's their sincerely held view. Like, if you ask them, that's what they care about. And so then, you know, in their biochem or their organic chemistry class, right, they're feeling kind of bored by the lecture. So then they decide to, like, get out their phone and watch TikTok videos instead. And so there, what we want to say is, like, by the agent's own lights, you know, they've got a mistaken value representation there, right? Because they said the most important thing was getting a good grade in this class so they can go into grad school. So they thought in the moment that TikTok was going to be more rewarding. The expected value was higher, but that was incorrect. Right, the longer term reward would have accrued to, like, paying attention, getting a better grade, getting into med school. So that's an easy kind of case, right? Because it's like the agent themselves said this was my goal, and so, you know, by their own lights, they can be more or less accurate with respect to that goal. There's a lot of harder cases, though, right, where you might think that collectively it might not be in our interest to attend in certain ways, and even if people themselves have the view that I want to do this, we might think that collectively that sort of thing is bad on the whole. And it's much harder to figure out how these accuracy conditions or these normative assessments work in those cases. So I think what we're sort of committed to is, like, there are those easier cases, right, where you can sort of say these things are mistaken by the subject's own lights. And that seems like the easy case. The harder cases are ones where it's just like, whoa, that's, like, more than you can do in one paper or one talk. But we hope that at least that minimal one shows that, like, no, it's sensible to talk about value representations misrepresenting value. And I think once you've got that, then you sort of open the door to the idea that we can normatively assess these things. They can be better or worse. People can be more or less skillful in doing it. And I think as a starting point, that's a big improvement over the sort of status quo in a lot of the discussions. Yeah, but great question. Thank you.
Why don't we take one from Zoom? Thomas, would you be willing to unmute?
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Cool. First of all, thanks for the talk. Really awesome. I'm just going to reiterate a question that I kind of typed out in the chat. So I'm curious about how this valuationist framework approaches sort of the phenomenon of recidivism in addictive behavior. So I'm understanding kind of this framework that you've laid out correctly. It seems to me that sort of like if you perform some kind of intervention that sort of helps realign people's value representations over certain actions. So for example, in the TikTok case, it might be showing them that browsing too much TikTok is actually not good for them. Then sort of if these people are like rational decision makers or like, you know, good reinforcement learning agents, then once they're aware that their value is misrepresented in this space, they shouldn't go back to this kind of behavior. But we sort of know empirically that, you know, relapses for drug users happen. I work a little bit in the misinformation space, and we know that sort of interventions for misinformation like nudges, those benefits tend to disappear among treated populations after you stop giving them nudges. So I'm curious to see how this framework would deal with that, because my understanding is that like maybe the kind of right decision-making modeling thing is more some kind of like Kahneman-Tversky style dual process theory, where like people have like a fast brain or a slow brain. So I'd be curious to see, well, first of all, whether or not this is a correct characterization I've made of your valuations framework, and secondly, like if that is correct, how it would sort of tackle that problem.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. Thank you. So how it handles cases of recidivism or sort of relapse, I suspect that the answer is going to involve what we would say is, a sort of cognitive distortion of some sort, right? So there's still a sort of there's still a value misrepresentation happening. So there's two ways, right? So one could be just in the moment, an inaccurate value representation. So to use your example, in an online environment, I stopped getting this nudge about misinformation. And so I just like inaccurately represent the expected value of like reading the story from this, bogus or skeptical source. So that might be one way, is you just say that the value representation is mistaken. The other tack would be to say that it's a problem of impaired control, right? So that the value representation is indeed accurate, right? It's accurately tracking the expected value of, reading the charitable versus the uncharitable news source or whatever. And then the problem is at the level of control, right? Or sort of selecting the action that does indeed have the highest expected value. And yeah, so there I'm inclined to say probably the latter would be the one I'd prefer, right? That they sort of, the value representation itself may still be accurate. It's probably just a problem of impaired or unreliable control in that case. And so what I don't know is if that is, the same sort of suggestion that you were making at the end of your comment about like, does that essentially just collapse into a dual process Kahneman and Tversky style account? So what do you think about that? Like, does that seem satisfying, or does it seem like the dual process is like doing something different or making a different prediction or giving a different explanation?
Yeah, no, I think that does make sense to me. I think, yeah, viewing sort of the valuationist framework as kind of being like correct, but like the control framework being different, I think that kind of makes sense to me. I guess I'm thinking about sort of like this Sendo-Mullainathan paper that came out a few years ago about this applied model of how we should think about people who consume too much content online and then they regret it later, where it's sort of like.
What was the paper? I just missed the name of the authors.
Oh, sorry. It's a Sendo-Mullainathan, John Kleinberg and Manish Raghavan paper about sort of engagement based optimization. And sort of they have an applied modeling paper, so no kind of like empirical grounding at all. But I think the idea is that people who consume too much content online and later regret it are kind of going through this dual process theory where sort of like their brain one tells them, in their fast brain tells them like in the moment that it's good to keep on browsing TikTok, but then later on their brain two sort of looks back at this lapse of control and thinks like, oh man, I really regretted doing that kind of thing.
Okay, that's good. So thank you for that suggestion. So I think, I'd like to look at that paper and see like, are these explanations competing or not? But that's a super helpful suggestion, and I really appreciate the like kind of relapse case as a potential counterexample. So thanks so much. It's a terrific set of questions.
Maybe you could
Thanks again for the talk.
pop the authors in the chat, Thomas.
Yeah, that'd be great if you don't mind. Thank
Kira,
you.
did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I was really thinking when you're talking about like Natasha Dow Schul's work, Addiction by Design, and
Yeah.
specifically around gambling
Mhm.
companies, because I think there's some really interesting, I mean, when you read the book, you see a lot of parallels with social media companies, especially because gambling has a more social element than something like maybe more drug addiction or alcohol. But the key point there, and admittedly, it's been a while since I've read this book, but is that kind of like intermittent reinforcement that, gambling can come, casinos rely on, that like it's kind of very behavioral psychology, that you give the rats the sugar reward every so often. And so like, and that seems to ring intuitively true with like, or so, if I get a notification on my phone, sometimes it's gonna be like some spam text, sometimes it's gonna be like a cute photo, like it's just such a range of responses.
Well, even within an app, right? Like the sort of notifications are never delivered chronologically, right? They're delivered at times where you're more likely to pick up your phone and engage. So
They're very boring, but there's just enough that kind of keeps you going. And so like, I'm kind of curious how that, like the value assessment, like I know if my phone dings, like there's like, the probability that it's of interest or rewarding is not 100%. It's like some threshold below. So, but I'm still you know, like I'm responding to it more because of that uncertainty. And so I'm kind of like curious how this like intermittent reinforcement plays in. And I know companies are aware of this,
Exactly,
like,
yeah.
intermittent reinforcement. And so like it seems to fit within your framework, but I'm just curious.
Totally. I mean, it's exactly, I mean, that idea is exactly the one that best predicts the way people learn. Right, and so it's sort of very congruent. Now, the one thing that I actually took from your comment, though, is that, you know, I love that book, Addiction by Design. And one of the things that she says in the introduction, which I, you know, quite like, and I like that book for exactly, I think it's a very good, you know, metaphor in many ways for the attention economy, even though it's about gambling, it sort of generalizes much beyond that context. But in the introduction to that book, you know, she says like explicitly that her method is like interactionist, right? So she says like it can't just be a story about problem gamblers, right? So the agency can't just be on the people who get addicted to the digital slot machines, but it can't be a story either of just predatory companies, right? Using the latest psychological research to how to figure out to get people to like drain their bank accounts on digital slot machines. And it can't just be a story that puts all the blame, you know, at the door of capitalism either. It has to be an interaction. So I think she says something in the introduction, like it's a story of like a problem society and problem gamblers and problem companies. And that kind of interactionist framework is exactly there. And like, I love teaching this book for that reason. Because I think like that's a very good method for, you know, doing like applied ethics in a technology setting. And it makes sense, right? That we sort of zoom in on one rather than the other. But I think like in response to Kimberly's comment earlier, right? Like the sort of zooming in on the individual level decision stuff, like it's just that, right? It's zooming in on one part of it. But in no way do I mean to suggest that it's like unimportant to think about the problematic practices like of the companies themselves. It's just like, you know, let's focus on this, what individuals can do. But like that commitment in that book, like that's very much how I try to approach all these problems.
Well, and also like there is value where it's like there's casinos exist not because everyone's addicted to gambling, but because people want to go to Vegas and have fun and like do that, right? That there's like value or people find value in it. Social media, and we should like they are delivering a service that
totally
in theory want, you know, but it's just that they also have like there's a lot of other incentives that are coming to bear in that, and that they are like trying to kind of keep us going beyond maybe what we actually want.
That's right. And, you know, to that point too, Hannah Pickard's work also is, you know, she's got a couple of papers highlighting precisely those social dimensions in the context of substance abuse as well. So I think that analogy, it actually, you sort of suggest maybe it doesn't work as well with drug. I think it actually does. I think it actually does work pretty well in that context. Yeah.
Good question here. Yeah.
Great talk. Very interesting framing. I'm definitely curious if I don't really have a question for this, but the idea of impaired control and what that means for vulnerable populations, children, like I think there's something interesting there with the regulation piece as well. But what I'm hoping to get some insight on is if there's a population that is, you know, there isn't a impair of control, in theory, then should you make the value proper, the implicit value of your addictive technology less valuable, then you should see less use of that. And I think anecdotally, we're hearing a lot of like, well, if you make your phone grayscale, you're less likely to pick it up. Or if you do all these, like there's businesses that are popping up simply focused on how to, you know, curb the addiction.
Totally.
I'm curious if you know of any work or if you guys are doing it yourselves around that idea of like, how do you reduce that value, that implicit value that, you know, maybe they haven't hijacked our attention per se, but hijacked our value prop because of these learning, like reinforcement learning ideas. Have you seen any of these like intervention methods actually empirically work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, I mean, the short answer is like, no. And I wish, but I think that's more from like a lack of serious searching, not like looking and not finding anything satisfying, right? And so we kind of conclude this paper by suggesting like, it's meant to just be to like put the discussion about those interventions on a more solid footing. And so I think that like if it's much easier to think about what effective interventions might look like and to design studies and to figure out how to assess them and to figure out what outcomes you care about and to figure out what populations you should run them in. When you've got this picture that like sort of coheres with lots of research in psychology and decision science and cognitive science, it's much easier to do that kind of work. And so we sort of view like at least this paper and everything we've said in this talk is just like explicitly providing a firmer footing to do that. And so how it actually gets done, I don't know. And I'm not sure that that's a question that like, ethicists are in a particularly good spot to answer. I mean, like, this is why we have intervention science, and I think that most people in this space will agree that, like, if you don't have the sort of if you don't have an idea about what the mechanism of action is, right, then any intervention, like, you might get lucky and hit it, but it's much more likely to be guided effectively if you've got some kind of causal explanatory story of what's going on here. And so we think about this work as trying to provide that. So it's an unsatisfying answer to what is definitely the most important question to ask. Yeah.
Kai, did you have a hand? Yeah. Oh, Alex, sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I want to go back to the, I guess, the student who wants to get into medical school but watches TikTok videos.
Yeah.
Maybe if, like, it's a one-off aberration, you can say it's going against what their stated goal is. But if their behavior overall actually seems structured, not towards getting into med school, but they're always watching TikTok videos, within the framework, is there a way to still say that their goal is getting into med school, or would you even be compelled to say that, like, we can infer from their behavior that it's not, or they have some other goal?
Yeah, so it's kind of like it's a question about, like, what's the theory of belief in the background here, right? So like a dispositionalist might just say, like, look, if you're just like not behaving in the ways that are in accordance with that belief or desire, you just like don't have that belief or desire. But other kinds of theories of belief might say it's, possible to do that. Like, I think we're a bit agnostic on, I think we'd say, like, sort of take your favorite theory of, beliefs and like plug it in there and see. But I mean, the sort of non-flippant thing that you're sort of raising there is very much like, what do we do in these cases? Is there some sort of standard external to the agent that we can appeal to describe their value representations as more or less correct? And this is one where I just feel like it's sort of opening up into these big questions about, like, what's intrinsically valuable versus instrumentally valuable. And then it's like just this huge can of worms, which I think is important. And I think for both me and Dylan, like, we think a really important next step in this kind of research program is trying to say more about what those sort of external standards might be that would allow us to make those descriptions. But basically, like in the paper version, we just say, like, here's the easy case, the hard case is too hard. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Let's go to the question that's been up. This person's been quite patient. Michael in the on Zoom. Are you willing to unmute, Michael?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to give my 2 cents. I think it's really important, just in terms of, like, talking about smartphone addiction and how everyone's on their phones nowadays. I do think it's important to tailor your time on social media on topics and, around people that are part of the industry that you want to go into or have the skill sets that you want to learn. Too many times, like, so much time is wasted just following celebrities or gossip and news and stuff like that. I've tuned that out many years ago. I just follow subjects such as, like, AI, technology, investing, just trying to learn new skills, because I think it's important to just understand the groundwork of things, and then from there you're able to kind of ascertain, oh, like, maybe this is the field or subject matter that I can continue going into. So I think it's like my 2 cents is just, I think it's really important to tailor your social media into things that actively are what you are pursuing. So that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks. And then we take it that, like, the framework that we put forward hopefully has an easier way of accounting for that than a lot of the ethics papers, which are sort of like very doom and gloom on this point. So thanks for the comment.
Yeah, great. Their question, Rich.
So I'm gonna try to stitch this together into like a cohesive single question.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk. This was really interesting, and it kind of, I appreciate it as a contrast to what we often hear about, things like phone addiction and the attention economy. But the one thing that I think I'm finding more kind of persuasive maybe about that view as opposed to this one is I'm having a harder time mapping this onto maybe like the larger societal context. Because there's the sort of scrolling, as I'm saying, scrolling to cover kind of a wide
Sure, yeah.
distracted behaviors.
Yeah.
There's scrolling as distraction, but there's also this kind of
scrolling as a replacement for hobby or interest. And there are arguments kind of on this sort of other view that you're sort of arguing, maybe not fully against, but like in contrast to, that acknowledge like how expensive it can be to pursue a hobby, or how difficult it can be to, I don't know, make friends and not feel lonely in a new city, that sort of thing. And I don't like the robbing of agency in that context, and I think it's kind of, it's infantilizing, but I have a hard time seeing how this kind of perspective then maps onto that element of excessive scrolling or social media usage, or, you know, that range of behavior.
So yeah, I'm not familiar with those arguments, so I think I can kind of grasp it. But so the sort of worry here is that there can be this positive value, and that like engaging in the sort of tools that we associate with the attention economy can just be like very valuable for people, could be sort of better than their like best alternative option. And so I guess I wasn't sure, like, and so because I guess I just feel like that's like the valuationist has a very easy way to explain that, right? They just say like, you value the cheaper, less socially anxiety producing, more convenient, more globally connected version of interaction compared to something else. So there's like, you know, the agent has a higher subjective worth for those kinds of interactions. So is there something that's like, so A, am I getting that right? Like the description of what you were saying, and B, like, is there something unsatisfying about that?
Yeah, so maybe it's just that like there's, and maybe this is sort of like a bigger picture issue then, is that maybe how this view then, the valuationist view, fits into kind of like a context where we're sort of told that that's bad.
Yes,
That's not,
yeah.
It's not good that your hobbies have been replaced by scroll.
Right, yeah. And so that gets back to like the previous question too, but like about the external standard. And so, I mean, I guess my response is like that isn't, you know, it's a problem for evaluationist view, but it's a problem for any other view too, because it's asking this question about like what the nature of well-being is, right? Is it subjective or is it objective? So objectivist views of well-being might just say, no, it's just like, if you're not, you know, interacting with people socially, for example, like everything is sort of parasitic on that. And so there's just some objective standard against which we judge that like there's less well-being involved in those sorts of activities. But then subjectivist accounts might just say, you know, no, like there's no objective standard of what kind of social interaction is better. And it just strikes me that that's like a sort of deep kind of like meta-ethical question that like is going to be a problem for any account here, not specific to valuationism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good questions. Maya?
Hi, thank you for the talk again. I wonder if there's space here for a kind of account of ease as opposed to just reward. It seems to me that, for example, in the TikTok example, kind of easier decision is perhaps to
Yeah,
as opposed to paying attention.
totally.
When we think about the kind of physical properties of these wonderful devices, our phones, that the fact that they're always in our pockets.
Yeah.
And they just open when they
Fit perfectly in our hands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like our face opens it.
Yeah.
It's so easy.
Yeah.
So I wonder how that comes into play when, you know, something like substances, for example, might not constantly kind of like be on us. So we have something that's very addictive.
Yeah.
Just always present and is required for certain elements of school and work.
Yeah.
There's something unique there about just the accessibility.
Yeah, so like, I mean, a couple of things to say about it. Like, I mean, one, you're, I think, quite right to point to like the highly engineered nature of these things. So it's not just devices, right? But like software, you know, digital environments are like this too. You know, news feeds are like this. Like the idea of infinite scroll just is that, right? And so there is, so like one objection that I take that's like a strong objection to our view is like, you might think that this focus on individual level decision making really downplays how highly engineered and optimized and streamlined these parts of the attention economy are, and that we're sort of not giving enough weight to the ways that they've like precisely like down to the, you know, level of the pixel, right, been designed precisely to capture our attention. And I want to say like, yeah, we're sort of like sensitive to that consideration, right? And so in response to like the addiction by design thing, right, I'm gonna say like, you know, the fact that we're focusing on the individual level decision processes and the way individuals use reward learning to develop value representations, right? That doesn't there's nothing in there that says we can't also be concerned with what you might call the sort of environmental factors, or the ways in which the environments are specifically engineered and designed in this very streamlined, frictionless, easy way. So I don't think of them as incompatible, right? I just think like we're focusing on one part, that's another part that's sort of equally weighty in our view. And yeah, I guess the second thing to say about it is that I do think that the kind of like expected value of control framework is meant to be able to predict exactly those decisions, right? So, you know, those frameworks, I think, tend to be very good at predicting and explaining, you know, why it is that people reach for their phones when they do. And it's because the expected value of doing that versus, you know, doing the hard work of paying attention to what your professor was saying when it's really confusing, right? The fact that it shows up as easier, that's a particular way of that, like, of the sort of cost benefit analysis, right? That the cost is just so much lower to look at your phone relative to engage in strict cognitive control, and the benefit's immediate. It's right now. It's not like longer term when I finish the class. So I think the picture we're painting is one that like is the best model we have of exactly how that behavior works. Yeah.
All right, I know there are more questions. It's lots of like a rich topic. And so I apologize, but I think we should end just to stay on time. I would invite people to pop them in the chat if you're online, and then that way there's some record that Gus can go back to.
Great, yes.
So let me just encourage you all to thank me or to sorry, to join me. Please, to join me in thanking Gus for his thought-provoking presentation. Not to thank me.
Thank you.